The sun glared down on the school courtyard as Kwon Daegan stood frozen, the word Baldy slipping out of his mouth without warning. The name had come so naturally, an old habit formed from working under a former boss who shared the same shiny scalp. But this time, the word wasn't aimed at a harmless superior. It had landed squarely on one jock, a former senior and a man whose fists were faster than his temper. The moment the insult echoed, silence fell over the group. Realizing his mistake, KWON immediately apologized, not once, but twice, his tone laced with both sincerity and mild amusement. Behind him, Kwon Dusik burst out laughing. To him, the new transfer student was far more entertaining than he had imagined, bold enough to casually insult a known powerhouse like Won Jok. Tension rose sharply as Ju Gong-myung, the second in command, under Jok, stepped forward and demanded Kwon and Suzy leave immediately. His voice was stern and dismissive, the kind that rarely tolerated refusal. But Kwon, never one to yield, stood his ground. Calmly, he reminded them that he had arrived first, and if anyone should leave, it was them. That was the last straw for Won Jok. His anger boiled over, and he stepped forward, ready to throw a punch. But just as his fist began to rise, Suzy's phone rang. The name flashing on her screen read, Baek Soo-jun, her brother. Ju Gong-myung, seeing the call and recognizing the weight the name carried, quickly held Jok back. Hurting Kwon might lead to a direct confrontation with Baek Soo-yoon, and no one wanted that, not even JAOK. With a sigh of frustration, Suzy stormed off, tossing a final warning over her shoulder before disappearing. As the crowd began to break apart, Dusik lingered behind, his knuckles clenched. The encounter had stirred something inside him, a growing itch to fight. He couldn't resist it. Without thinking twice, he broke into a sprint, eyes locked on KWON. Sensing the rush of footsteps, reacted swiftly. He grabbed Suzy and pulled her close, shielding her behind his body like a protective barrier. His stance lowered, eyes narrowed, ready for impact. Dusik reached him and launched a barrage of punches, each one wild and heavy, but KWON's reflexes were too sharp. He dodged each strike with precision, weaving between the fists like wind through branches. Then, with one swift move, Kwon delivered a powerful slap across Dusik's face. The sound cracked through the air, but somehow, Dusik stayed on his feet. Kwon blinked in surprise. Most people would have collapsed from a hit like that. But Dusik wasn't like most people. With Suzy still behind him, KWON was limited in movement. One wrong step could drag her into the chaos, and he couldn't allow that. Dusik saw the hesitation and pressed forward. He slipped past KWON's defenses and landed a solid kick into KWON's side. Ju Gong-myung, recognizing the danger, quickly pulled Suzy away to a safer distance. Freed from distraction, Kwon straightened his posture. He clenched his fists and advanced. This time, his fists struck true. One hit, then another, and finally, a heavy blow that sent Dusik tumbling backward. But even then, he didn't fall. He stumbled, groaned, and stood again. Kwon's eyes caught something white cloth peeking from under Dusik's sleeve. A bandage. Curious, Kwon tilted his head and asked about it. Dusik dismissed the question with a grunt, saying it was nothing. Kwon smiled, calm, cool and cold. He stepped forward, eyes glowing with resolve, and said with ease that if Dusik thought that injury was painful, then he'd better brace himself. Because from now on, what he'd feel would be far worse. The air between Kwon Daegan and Kwon Dusik thickened with tension. After the previous blows were exchanged, KWON's eyes narrowed with renewed intensity. His voice was calm, but firm as he announced that from this moment forward, he would fight. Seriously. Without hesitation, KWON began unbuttoning his school shirt, peeling it off as if shedding his restraint. But before he could fully remove it, a loud shriek cut through the courtyard. Suzy's face flushed with shock and outrage as she yelled at Kwon, her voice echoing across the school grounds, warning him not to take off his clothes in such a public place. Kwon turned to look at her, puzzled by her reaction, and he noticed the crowd. Dozens of students had gathered, their curious eyes fixated on him. He hadn't realized how many spectators had assembled during the fight. For a brief moment, even Dusik looked flustered. With the fight turning into a spectacle, he rolled his shoulders and stepped back, declaring that this wasn't the right time to finish things. Without waiting for a response, he turned and began walking away. Jugong Myung, still burning with irritation, stared at Kwon with barely contained rage. He took a step forward, muttering that they would meet again. But Kwon, unshaken, responded coolly, stating that he would rather beat them both at the same time next time. He had no interest in wasting time fighting them separately. The provocation landed like a slap. Jugong's hands clenched, his body twitching with the urge to retaliate. But before he could act, one jock raised a hand, his voice calm yet commanding. He ordered Jugong to let it go, and with visible frustration, Jugong complied, turning away reluctantly. Now, only Kwon and Suzy remained. Kwon looked at her, his expression unreadable, and asked whether Biksu, the person Suzy had claimed to call earlier, would really show up. Suzy turned her eyes away, mumbling nothing in particular. Her silence told Kwon everything he needed to know. There was no phone call. It had been a bluff. Neither of them said anything else. After that brief moment of awkwardness, they parted ways without another word, each returning to their own class. As the onlookers began to disperse, meanwhile, inside his classroom, Dusik returned to his usual antics. He laughed loudly, kicked at desks, and mocked students who were too timid to fight back. His presence oozed dominance. He was the kind of bully who couldn't rest until someone else was under his heel. Elsewhere in the building, Kwon sat deep in thought. His mind was still caught on what Minho had told him, that the operational funds flowed all the way to the top, ultimately landing in the hands of Baek Suyuk. That revelation shifted something inside him. For now, however, he couldn't get Dusik out of his mind. Dusik had taken his hitsets that would have knocked out any other student hand. Yet he remained standing. Kwon knew there was more to Dusik than met the eye. That evening, as the sky darkened and the final bell had long since rung, a lone student walked along a quiet road. He was the same boy who had tried to hire Dusik Sr. to take Dusik down. The boy's steps slowed when he noticed someone standing in the path ahead. Duosik, without a word, Dusik approached. The boy tried to turn and run, but Dusik was too fast. In the dim light of the evening, Dusik's fists rained down. The punches weren't quick, they were slow, deliberate, and filled with the kind of violence born from rage and humiliation. There was no crowd this time, no one to interfere. Just Dusik, and the boy who had dared to use someone else to hurt him, and Dusik made sure he'd never try it again. Inside the classroom, the atmosphere was unusually lively. Kwon Daegan sat at a desk, surrounded by Minho, Hojung, and Jongmin, as they casually engaged in a quiz session together. Surprisingly, even Jongmin, who rarely participated in academic games, was joining in, tossing answers around with enthusiasm. Despite his quiet reputation as a diligent student, Kwon wasn't faring well in the quiz. He was losing, and the most unexpected victor was Ginmo, who answered more questions correctly than anyone else. The result came as a shock to all, but none more so than Kwon himself. Jinmo, wearing a smug grin, teased Kwon about his defeat, telling him he should study harder next time if he didn't want to be embarrassed again. Though he meant it as a joke, Kwon's pride flared. He rose from his seat, his face stern and fists clenched, ready to swing at Jinmo, who immediately raised his hands and apologized before things escalated. Kwon stared him down for a moment longer, then sat back down with a grunt. Suddenly, the door slid open. Kwon Dusik walked in without hesitation. The room fell into silence. He didn't say a word. At first he simply walked over and tried to sit next to Kwon. But Hojung, unsettled by his presence, objected. He stood in front of Dusik, blocking him. In response, Dusik raised his hand and slapped Hojung hard across the face. The sharp sound rang out through the class. Hojung stumbled backward, holding his cheek in disbelief. The rest of the students froze. Kwon stood up. The air between them thickened as Dusik and Kwon stared into each other's eyes, tension crackling between them. Outside the classroom, Two other students stood in hushed conversation. Gu Sanghua and Zhu Gongmeng were leaning against the wall. Watching the hallway, they spoke quietly, discussing Duzok's recent activities. Word had it that Duzok had started hitting the gym, training intensely every day. He was building his strength, preparing for something, perhaps for someone. Back inside, Duzok made a strange proposal. He suggested that he and Quan settle something through a simple game of rock, paper, scissors. It seemed childish, absurd even, but Quan, never one to shy away from challenges, played along. They faced off, throwing hands in rhythm. Quan won every single round. Duzok stood still for a moment, silent and unreadable. Then he turned and left the classroom, but not before delivering a message. He wanted to face Kwon in the gym. It would be a proper fight, witnessed by the students of Class 2. That was his challenge. Manhwa, who had been watching closely, immediately approached Kwon and warned him. He suspected this was a trap, a setup designed to catch Quan off guard, or perhaps to humiliate him. Manhwa urged Quan to ignore it, to not walk blindly into something dangerous. But Kwon had never been the type to retreat. Shortly after Duzok's departure, another student entered the classroom. He looked nervous, eyes darting as he spoke quickly. He revealed the real motive behind Duzok's challenge. It wasn't just about pride. Duzok had made a bet with one of the second-year students. A wager had been placed on who would win in the upcoming fight, Duzok or Quan. Everything had been arranged. It wasn't just a personal grudge now. It was entertainment for the upperclassmen. Money, ego, and status were on the line. Quan listened in silence, absorbing every word. His face was calm, but his mind was already moving fast. The gym, the crowd, the trap, he understood now. But understanding didn't change anything. Quan wasn't the type to step back, not even from a setup. After school ended, the rain had started to fall in thin, cold sheets. The sky above turned a dull gray as Quan Dagon walked silently alongside the student who had visited his classroom earlier. Their footsteps echoed on the wet pavement, both heading toward a destination the boy had hesitantly mentioned, a place where Quan Duzok had once borrowed money. The location, as Quan learned, wasn't a typical loan spot. It was a hideout run by gangsters. Upon reaching the alley where the shady building stood, Quan stopped in front of the rusty metal door and looked at the boy beside him. Without saying much, he told the boy to wait outside. This was something he needed to investigate on his own. Quan stepped inside. The lighting was dim, casting long shadows across the narrow hall. The air smelled of cigarette smoke, sweat, and something metallic. Inside, a large man with a tattoo peeking out from his collar greeted Kwon with a curious glare. He didn't say much, only motioned for Quan to come in. As Quan approached the desk, the gangster leaned forward and asked a simple question: his age. Quan almost instinctively said he was 20. But halfway through the sentence, his voice cracked. He hesitated. He knew they could easily verify his information. Quickly correcting himself, he stammered and admitted that he was only 17. The man narrowed his eyes. Something about Kwon's presence felt off. Quan sensed the tension and decided it was time to leave. He turned to walk away without another word. But the man didn't let him. He stood and blocked Kwon's path, suspicious of his odd behavior. As the man reached for an ashtray with clear intent to use it as a weapon, Quan moved swiftly. In a flash, Kwon deflected the incoming object and delivered a sharp strike to the man's temple. The blow knocked the gangster down instantly. His body collapsed to the floor, unconscious but breathing, his hand still clutching the edge of the desk. Quan didn't panic. He stepped over the fallen man and calmly scanned the room. On the desk, something caught his eye: a photograph, framed and dusted. It was an image of a man in a tailored suit, shaking hands with someone. It was the director of the CEO group, the same man from the corporate world, now connected to this underground money-lending circle. Kwon furrowed his brows. Why was his picture here? Before he could dwell on it longer, Quan heard faint sounds beyond the entrance. The door creaked. Slightly, someone else was entering the building. Kwon didn't hesitate. He walked out, his steps slow and steady. Outside, several men were entering through the hallway. One of them made eye contact with Kwon and asked if he had business there. Kwon simply replied that his business was finished. He kept walking past them, calm and unbothered. None of them suspected anything, until one of them noticed the unconscious body on the floor behind the desk. Voices raised. Chaos erupted. Kwon heard the yelling, the hurried footsteps, the realization they were chasing him now. But somehow, even in the maze of back alleys and slick roads, Kwon managed to lose them. He darted through narrow paths, climbed fences, and slipped into crowded areas until the shouting faded into the rain-soaked night. Wet and winded, he slowed down only when he was certain no one followed. Elsewhere, Kwon Dusik stood under the faint light of the gym's overhead lamps. The warehouse-like building was filled with murmurs and anticipation. A crowd had already gathered. Students from various classes, especially Class 2, were seated or standing along the walls, waiting. Gusanghwa was already there, watching with cold curiosity. Everyone was there for the same reason. They were waiting for Kwon. Daegun, the boy who'd made enemies of nearly every class leader. The boy who might just face his biggest trap yet. Inside the old gymnasium, the crowd continued to grow. Students from multiple grades had packed the room, murmurs and footsteps echoing across the concrete floor. Everyone knew something big was going to happen tonight. Word had already Dusik was going to face off against Kwon Daegun. Excitement buzzed in the air. Class 2 students leaned on the walls, whispering predictions. Others sat in circles, eyes locked on the entrance. The tension was thick, but Kwon Daegun had yet to arrive. Minho, standing tall with his usual confident grin, had already come with his group. His hands clutched a metal bat, slung over his shoulder casually. Behind him, several members of his circle carried blunt tools, pipes, wooden sticks, and whatever else they could sneak in. But as soon as Kwon saw the gear, his expression hardened. Without hesitation, he scolded Minho sharply and ordered him not to bring things like that again. Violence was inevitable, but weapons were a different matter. Kwon told the group they weren't needed. He instructed them to leave the gym and let him handle things his own way. But Manhwa, ever stubborn, ignored the command. With his companions close behind, he went ahead and entered the gym first. Without Kwon, the crowd turned to watch them arrive. Murmurs grew louder as more and more students, especially upperclassmen from Class 2, streamed into the gym. The numbers inside swelled, and the atmosphere grew heavier with each new arrival. Time passed. Kwon still hadn't shown up. Dusik paced near the center of the gym. Growing more and more agitated, he muttered curses under his breath. Everyone was here, ready, waiting. But Kwon was making them all wait. That arrogance made Dusik's blood boil. Finally, unable to hold back any longer, Dusik yelled across the gym. He declared that he needed to warm up while waiting for that bastard Kwon. His gaze landed on Minho, and he motioned toward him, inviting him for a quick spar as a warm-up. But Gusanghwa, standing nearby, quickly stepped forward and tried to calm him down. He warned Dusik to stay in top shape for Kwon. Wasting energy now would be foolish. Then, the front door creaked open, all eyes turned. A shadow entered through the threshold. Everyone held their breath, expecting to see Kwon Daegun. But it was Kim Myung-jung. A ripple of disappointment moved through the room. Doosik's patience shattered. Seeing Myung alone, unprotected, sparked a cruel idea. Without hesitation, Dusik stormed toward him. Fueled by frustration and rage, he threw brutal punches at Myung. Blow after blow landed, loud and heavy. Myung collapsed under the assault, helpless and unresisting. He was left unconscious, sprawled on the gym floor. And then, the real door opened. Kwon Daegun had finally arrived. His eyes immediately found Myung's limp body. Without changing his expression, he stepped forward, slowly removing his shirt as he walked toward the center of the gym. The murmurs stopped. Silence filled the space. Kwon's lean frame was covered in small scratches, but his muscles tightened as he moved with intent. He didn't look at Dusik, not yet. Instead, Kwon turned to Dusik's two friends, standing nearby ones, who had been grinning moments before. In a flash, he launched 2 lightning-fast kicks. Each strike landed with brutal precision. Both boys flew backward, their bodies slamming against the wall. They crumpled instantly, unconscious. Gasps erupted. The gym fell quiet again. Kwon stood tall in the center, his eyes scanning the stunned crowd. Calm but fierce, he simply stated that he, too, needed to warm up. And now, after dispatching Dusik friends, things were even. The real battle was about to begin.